right, well, thanks everyone so much for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is my first time doing a webinar where I can't see everyone's faces, so it's nice to have you all on. We're very excited for this conversation. My name is Theodora Skiatis. I am the president of the HCAS New England Alumni Association. Our mission is to foster a community of alumni to continue the school's public service mission through programming that inspires graduates to expand their knowledge, their network, and their impact on the world. So we're very happy that you can be part of this experience with us today. Just a few ground rules before we get started. So as you can see, videos are turned off for this webinar. All you can see are the panelists. And I'll be hopping off in just a minute. It'll just be Alki and Cass. We have everybody muted for now. However, during the Q&A, you may be able to unmute so that you can ask questions. And in the meantime, we encourage you to use the chat feature so that you can have your questions recorded, and Alki, who will be moderating the Q&A, can look through them during that portion of the event. So without further ado, Alki is going to introduce our speaker, Cass. Thanks so much for being here.
All right, hey everyone. I don't know how much introduction Cass needs. He's the very famous author of the Nudge book, and we have a new book coming up that I guess we can just explain a little more during the talk about change and interesting things about humans. Cass is a professor at the Harvard Law School, and he was an Obama advisor. I think everybody knows him already, so I'll just give it to him to start, and then we can have questions afterwards. Let's keep all our questions for the end. There's a Q&A button. Why don't you use that? And if you want to ask questions, you can just raise your hand, and then we'll enable it to talk. So, Cass, thank you for being here. We're all ears.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Thanks for being present in this way. I'm going to be talking about a book project that I've been working on for about 10 years and that I got blocked on. 10 years is a long time for a book. And I'm going to tell you two incidents that helped me get unblocked. The first is I found myself at a big party maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I was in a group of about 8 or 10 people, one of whom was one of the world's great athletes. And for reasons that will become clear, I'm not going to tell you his name. But I found I had a chance to ask him, it was a guy, a question I always wanted to ask one of the world's great athletes. I said to him, if the game is winding down and it's really close and everything's on your shoulders, and he's sufficiently great that that's not hypothetical, everything is on his shoulders toward the end. I asked, when it all turns on you, whether you do well or poorly in the remaining moments, I said, I have a question for you. Are you having fun? And he looked around at our little group of maybe 8, 9 people, and he said, you asked me if I'm having fun when the game's on the line? The answer is absolutely, I'm having fun. So that's what I was born for. This is what I do. And he said, I don't mean to brag, but you know, I perform well under pressure. And if the question is if I'm enjoying it, of course I'm enjoying it. It's the best time of my life. Now that answer really surprised me, I confess. I play a little sport called squash, and I know some of the really strong squash players, and I was startled by his answer. So I found myself about an hour later, kind of in the corner of the room, and he, like me, a little bit shy, and the two of us were in the corner of the room. I kind of beckoned to him. I said, come over, and I took him into this place near a curtain. He's very tall. I'm not going to tell you his name. He's very tall. And I looked up at him and I said, your answer really surprised me. You said that under, you know, the waning moments of the game, you're having fun. I asked, is that really true? And he said, do you want the real answer? I said, yes, absolutely. And he said, no, I'm not having fun. It's terrible. In the last minutes of the game, when it's all on me, I can perform. Don't get me wrong. I know what to do. He famously performs well under pressure. He said, the pressure is horrible. It's all on my shoulders. I'm not having fun. I'm focused. It's not at all fun. Okay, a light bulb went off in my head. That liberated me to give the remarks I'm about to give. The second light bulb came on, what really made it possible for me to do this book, when I read an academic paper on Saudi Arabia. And the paper was an experiment where young men in Saudi Arabia were asked whether they mind if their wives work outside of the home. Now, this, as it turns out, is an important question because at the relevant time, men in Saudi Arabia, it might still be true, I think it's not, but it might still be, by law or custom, men in Saudi Arabia get to decide whether their wives work. It's up to them. They have veto authority. And the Saudi men, the young Saudi men, overwhelmingly said, great, I'm completely good with my wife working outside of the home. I like that idea. I'm positive about it. But then they were asked, what do you think other young Saudi men think? And the answer was the same in its numbers, meaning overwhelming numbers said something. And what they said was, no, they all think it's terrible. Okay, here's where things got interesting. Half of the very large sample of young Saudi men were told, actually, your beliefs are widely shared. What you think, which is it's fine, that's what most Saudi men think. Now, here's where things got interesting. Months later, among the population of Saudi men who were informed about what young Saudi men actually think, the number of wives who applied for jobs and ended up working outside the home skyrocketed. You had a massive increase. Okay, these are the same story I just told you. They are stories about people having in their heads something different from what they're willing to say publicly. The athlete in my story was not willing to say in a group of 9 or 10 people that he hated the pressure moments. That would have predictably ended up in the newspaper, maybe the front page of the sports section. He knew that. That's, by the way, why I'm not telling you his name. He trusted me. And once he was given a kind of green light by my private repeated question, he said the truth. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, the young Saudi men were willing to say the truth within their families once they were given the kind of green light that came from being told what the actual social norm is. So they're the same story. Okay, my topic is why social change comes from nowhere. Why is it that Brexit, that hashtag #MeToo, that the interest in some of President Trump's views on immigration, that the feminist movement of the 1970s, that the civil rights movement of the 1960s, why did they come, in most of these cases, out of nowhere? How did that happen? I'm going to try to explore first the unanticipated nature of major social change, and second, the mechanisms behind social change. And I'm going to give you 4 of them, and I'm going to name them in a moment. Okay, to vindicate the premise of my question, Tocqueville said that the French Revolution was expected by nobody. That's Tocqueville, who was there at the time, and maybe the most astute social theorist in the history of humanity. Said no one expected it. Lenin was stunned by the success and speed of the Soviet Revolution, and that's Lenin, the architect. I was in the White House at the time of the Arab Spring, and I'm here to tell you that the best analysts in the White House and in London did not expect the Arab Spring. They just thought it wasn't going to happen. And it isn't because they weren't good. It's because of something else that I'm going to try to get a fix on. The Iranian Revolution of a couple of decades ago, if you see the pictures of the revolutionaries, you can see on their faces in some of their shock that they were actually succeeding, that the Iranian Revolution was succeeding. Okay, I promised you I'd tell you the mechanisms. I wish there were 2. Unfortunately, there are 4. And there will be a test afterwards, so please remember them. It's a test which is going to be at an unanticipated moment and the future of The Kennedy School depends on your answering the test accurately, so I hope you'll remember the 4. I don't have an acronym. The first is preference falsification. And the story of the athlete and the Saudi Arabia young men is about preference falsification, to be explained shortly. The second is diverse thresholds. I'm not going to explain that now. I'm going to get to that. The third is interdependencies, and don't think about bad romances. Think about the ways our own beliefs and actions depend on others. That includes bad romances, but it's not limited to bad romances. And the fourth is group polarization. And I'm going to explain each of these 4. Okay, let's start with preference falsification. You already have a glimpse. And there's one book on Nazism that and Hitler that I actually enjoy, only one. And it's a book called They Thought They Were Free. And it's a book written by American and German ancestry who went back to Germany, not yesterday, but in the 1950s, to find out how his people could have gone Nazi. And what he did was to just talk to people who had been Nazis, not leaders, but people who were Nazis, figure out what happened to you all. And to his surprise, he liked every one of them. He got to know 10 particularly well. He referred to them as his friends. And it's hard to read the book without liking them too. Here's a little flavor. He asked one of them, former Nazi, didn't you oppose Hitler? Didn't you oppose him at some level? What happened? And the answer was this: opposition. How would anybody know? How would anybody know what somebody else opposes or doesn't oppose? That a man says he opposes or doesn't oppose depends on the circumstances. Where and when and to whom, and just how he says it. And even then, you must still guess why he says what he says. That's beautiful, isn't it? Think of #MeToo a little bit in that light, or of other unanticipated social changes, including the election of President Trump, which most people didn't foresee. The thought is that people live in a world of pluralistic ignorance. That is a world in which they don't know what other people prefer and believe. Under oppressive regimes, communist regimes or authoritarian regimes, preference falsification is all over the place because people will get in trouble if they say what they think. But even in democratic, freedom-loving regimes, there is preference falsification all over. Also, not as much, but also. All of us, every one of us, has beliefs or values or preferences in our head, which we've told no one probably, maybe our closest intimates, but maybe not even them. That's just part of what it is to be human. And that's both a problem of predicting what's going to happen, because that thing in the head might be widely thought, and it's also a problem of an opportunity, that is, where if someone gives a green light or a license, then some societies can go whoosh. That where formerly people feared they'd be shunned or maybe punished or just a raised eyebrow, now they feel unleashed to say what they think. Mask wearing now in the current crisis is everywhere. And one part of it, not the whole thing by any means, but one part of it is people who had previously wanted to wear masks, now they have at least a permission slip, and maybe more than that. Okay, I read to you something from Germany in the 1950s. Here's something from Syria relatively recently, not yesterday, but relatively recently. When you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences, that everything is okay inside Syria. Syria's a great country. The economy's doing great. It'll take him like 6 months, up to a year, to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels. Then he might start whispering. He won't speak loudly. That's too scary. After all that time, even outside Syria, you feel that someone is listening someone is recording. So this point, the first and most complicated of my four, is about political correctness writ large. Don't think of it as only left-wing orthodoxy, though it's partly that. Think of that as an instrument for inducing preference falsification. Okay, to tell about diverse thresholds, the second of my quartet, I have to tell you a story. I was in the Middle East a few years ago in a dangerous neighborhood without English speakers. And a friend of mine who's Irish American and I were the two foreigners in this not very good area. And we saw about 200 yards from us a father beating up his son, about a 10-year or 11-year-old, just beating I think the technical word is beating the crap out of his son. And before I could even breathe, really, my Irish American friend ran to the scene. And though he wasn't very tall, my friend, and he wasn't very young, my friend, he started yelling at this guy in English, "Stop hitting your son." And he said it with a kind of ferocity that the father did stop, and he looked abashed, and he put his arm around his son, and he kind of made a, peace. I was right behind my friend. Now, this is a story about two different thresholds. The threshold for responding to injustice on the part of my friend was 0. He didn't need anyone. He was there like lightning. In this story, and this is mildly embarrassing, I was not a 0. I don't know what I would have done if I'd been by myself. I was a 1. I was right behind him. Yeah, I didn't stay where I was, but I didn't go first. Okay, the point is that some people just are zeros in the sense that they will move in response to something that's bad without needing anything. Their threshold is nothing. Other people are 1s, as I was in this tale. Others are 2s, others are 3s, others are 4s, and people are all the way up to infinites. #MeToo is a good example where some women were 0s, not a lot. Some were 1s, some were 2s, some were 10s, and some are infinites. They're not going to say anything. The infinites are particularly interesting. That is that the infinites may have fear, they may have loyalty, they may be really busy, but they're just not going to move. Okay, to understand the role of thresholds, we need to go to the third piece, which is interdependencies. Thresholds are an individual thing, and it's very hard for any of us to know what our threshold is. When are we going to wear a mask? When are we going to volunteer? When are we going to give to a cause? It may be very hard to know. When are we going to stand up to somebody who's punching somebody? You might not know until you're on the scene or in the thick of it. Okay, here's a quotation on interdependencies from a woman named Beverly Young Nelson, who accused Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore of having sexually assaulted her. She said, "I thought I was Mr. Moore's only victim. I would probably have taken what he did to me to my grave had it not been for the courage of 4 other women who are willing to speak out about their experiences. Their courage has inspired me to overcome my fear." So she's, by her own account, she's being roughly a 5. Her action required the predecessor action of others. The basic point is that given diverse thresholds, what happens is crucially dependent on who else is seen to have done what and exactly when. This suggests that a social change may occur. It might involve the adoption of a product. It might involve the success of a startup. It might involve Taylor Swift's triumphs. She's great, by the way, but in another world, she wouldn't have done so well. It might involve the success of an idea. Everything depends on the right distribution of thresholds and the right kind of visibility of others. If the 1s see the 2s and the 3s see the 2s, If the 2 see the 1s and the 3 see the 2s and the 4 see the 3s and the 5 see the 4s, we're going to get a lot happening. But if the 4s aren't visible to the 5s, or if the 7s aren't visible to 8s, there may be a social movement that never happens. This suggests that when there is large-scale social change, it's often tempting to think in retrospect, it was bound to happen. It may be the success of Apple. It may be the success of Brexit. But just like a virus, really, everything depends on interactions. And if something major happens, it wasn't inevitable. It happened to happen. And if something doesn't happen, it never makes the history books. It's not that it was doomed from the start. It's that it happened not to happen. Okay, my last of the moving parts. So we have preference falsification, diverse thresholds, social interdependencies. The last one is group polarization. And I have a story for you, which is that long before I thought of this stuff, these remarks, I was involved in an experiment in Colorado in which we got a group of people from Boulder, which is a left of center, together to talk about an international treaty to control climate change. And we got a group of people from Colorado Springs together to talk about the same thing. Actually, more precisely, we got a lot of groups together. We got multiple groups of 6 people. Here's what we did in both cities. We asked the people in Boulder to say anonymously whether they wanted an international treaty on climate change, something like the Paris Agreement, and how much they wanted it. We did the same thing in Colorado Springs, anonymously. Then we had the Boulder people in their groups of 6 deliberate to a group verdict, and we had the Colorado Springs people deliberate to a group verdict. And then we had them record their views anonymously. What I personally was interested in was how would their anonymous views change as a result of talking with like-minded others? What would happen to the people in Boulder in their anonymous statements after they talked to other people in Boulder? Here's what happened. While in Colorado Springs, they didn't like the international treaty on average, after they talked with one another, they hated the international treaty unanimously. In Boulder, on average, they wanted the international treaty, but after they talked to each other, they all wanted the international treaty yesterday. People in both cities became more confident, more unified, and more extreme in their anonymous views. That's to say that Colorado Springs was a little bit, I should say, to my right on these issues, Boulder a little to my left on these issues. But after they talked to each other, they were in different political universes. They were on these 2 issues way right and way left. Okay, this is group polarization, and it is a wellspring of social change. It helps explain some of the social divisions we're observing about COVID-19 today. The basic idea is that like-minded people engaged in conversation with one another typically end up in a more extreme position in line with their pre-deliberation tendencies. I'm speaking now from Concord, Massachusetts, actually one of the places that the British soldiers went on April 19, 1775. And one of the places, I don't mean Concord, I mean this house in particular they came to. And as a result of living in this house, I've studied the American Revolution. And what made it fuel was partly the story of the athlete. People started to feel licensed to say, I want this revolution. And partly like-minded people, literally in Concord, in this house, started talking to one another and went from, you know what, maybe we should split from England to, you know what, it's time for a war. It's time for a revolution. Okay, the Chinese government, this is kind of academic, so let's show reality here. The Chinese government is alert to this. A study by Harvard's own Gary King, some of you may know him, of the government's behavior on the equivalent of Chinese Twitter, found 2 things. Thing 1, if people say on Chinese Twitter, the Chinese government isn't very good, we need democracy, they're making all sorts of mistakes, in the relevant time period not long ago, that was allowed. Dissent and disagreement were allowed. the Chinese government would flood the system with more upbeat appraisals, but it wouldn't punish or take down those things. By contrast, if people said, we're going to have a protest meeting in June, on the 5th of June, on this street at this time, trouble. That's taken down. And that person might be punished. The basic idea is that if you have a meeting in person that's announced publicly, group polarization is likely to happen. The distribution of thresholds might fuel something, and the risk is real that you will have a social movement. These remarks help explain, I think, why social change is so often so unpredictable. With respect to coronavirus, we're witnessing group polarization. People with diverse thresholds are doing different things, and social interactions have proved crucial to health promoting activity, and in some cases have proved unhelpful to health promoting activity. Just about done. I'm going to give one complication, and it's captured in a recent statement from a woman in North Korea. She said, "It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. It was just how things are." That's different from what I've discussed. She did not say, "I wanted social change, but I felt I couldn't say so." The key word in her almost poem is want. It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. It was just how things are. That's different from my little quartet because it suggests that social change sometimes doesn't elicit hidden thoughts, it changes wants. Now, it can do that by creating a want where one didn't exist before. You know, I want civil rights, or I want religious liberty. It can also take a very quieted, silenced, but not non-existent voice in the head and give it room to breathe. And I'm going to tell you, since you're all friends now, I'm going to tell you a personal story that a kind of buried memory in my own head that hadn't risen to the top until I was working on this. And that was in the 1980s, I started writing about feminism in law. I was really interested in it. It was taking off a little bit in the law schools. And I talked to my mother every Sunday, and she asked me most Sundays, "What are you working on?" And she asked me that Sunday, and I said, "There's this new thing, feminism. I'm working on feminism in law." And her response was, "No," very loud. So, "What do you mean?" She said, "No, you work on constitutional law. You work on regulation. You don't work on that." I said, "What's interesting?" She said, "No, that's terrible. Don't do that." She was fierce, and she really let me have it. And as my mother's son, I didn't take it lightly. I got mad at her. And it was one of our really bad fights. And I kind of let loose, explaining why it was important and it wasn't stupid or worthless for me to work on it. And she paused. And that was extremely rare for my mother. She hardly ever paused. And she said three words that my mother had never said to her only son, and she never said after. Only time she had said these three words to me. The words she said were, "God bless you." And in those words, forgive me, she's no longer with us. In those words were a book. She was telling me in those words, "You don't know the half of it." She was, a very intelligent woman who had encountered a lot of stuff. I think she told my dad a little bit about it. She told me a tiny, tiny bit after. But with those words, whose timbre I'm not able to capture, she was saying, "You know what? I know everything you're saying, and a lot." Okay, these are descriptive remarks. I've tried to say something about the four well springs of social change. Remember, preference falsification, diverse thresholds, group polarization, and social interactions. But there's a kind of moral heart to these remarks, which is that people all over the world, including the United States today, are facing injustice or deprivation. Things aren't quite right. It might involve the workplace, it might involve the family, it might involve their community, it might involve their health. Human progress depends on someone, somewhere, giving those people a green light or a permission slip. Remember, if you would, those words from the Syrian who actually was a computer programmer. When you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences, that everything is okay. It'll take like 6 months up to a year to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels. Then they might start whispering. They won't speak loudly, but eventually they're going to. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gus, for the emotional perspective, together with all the intellectual food that you're giving us. Very much appreciated. Anyone that wants to ask a question, you guys can raise your hand, and I can give you the rights through Zoom to speak, and then I'll just ask a question that we have here in the chat. If for the diverse threshold theory that this person finds very interesting, if you have any reference to academic papers about this topic for further exploration.
Yes, the best is by Mark Granovetter, Granovetter. It's called Threshold Models of Collective Behavior. It's extremely simple and phenomenal. And Granovetter, as a political scientist, is sometimes mentioned as a Nobel Prize candidate, and it's on the strength of this paper. I'll give another reference. What Granovetter didn't capture is people's preference falsification. There's a guy named Timur Kuran, Kuran, who has a book called Private Truths, Public Lies, which applies this to preference falsification. And I have a little paper called Unleashed, which does this for some of the topics we've discussed. And I have a book called How Change Happens, which is basically all about this.
Another question that I'd like to understand a little more is for the preference falsification. Does it always mean that people know what's real for them, or do they perhaps not even know themselves?
Okay, what a great question. So in the standard thinking about preference falsification, people know. So like the Saudi guys completely knew either more money's good or equality's good or employment's good. They didn't have any ambivalence or confusion. And in my athlete story, that guy completely knew how he feels when the game depends on him. But it's a fantastic question, because a lot of us have, maybe I think this, but I don't know. And the reason the maybe is in bold letters is because we have a social red light. I'll give you an example from my own mind, which is that I'm pretty keen on animal rights of the utilitarian sort, but I guess they're weakening. But the social norms that I worked in the White House in a Senate confirmed job, and I almost didn't get through because I'm interested in animal rights, and the death threats and the amazing level of agitation many good people have. I met with them. They're good people, but they think crazy person or threatening person. So on animal stuff, a lot of people, they kind of know, or they lean toward, but why bother if the consequence is people you like are going to be really upset with you. So there's a lot that's in this zone of, I maybe think this, or I would be willing to think that, something like that. And we're witnessing, I'm giving the mask example because it's so salient. Now, at least where I live, it's tipped so that there's something like casual empiricism, let's call it, which is a word for anecdotes, is that 90% of people plus are wearing masks. But there was a time when people kind of wanted to wear masks, but they thought they'd look weird. And it wasn't really preference falsification, it was more kind of leaning. So thank you for the question.
All right, I'm gonna move to a different question from our friend Lara Zatz. How do you think we could use social norms to increase compliance with the mask wearing and physical distancing to prevent the spread of COVID-19? Do you have specific recommendations for local or state governments, NGOs, or individuals?
Yes, so I'm actually, because I work on this stuff, I'm working with some governments on exactly this. And to publicize the existing or emerging social norm in a very upbeat rather than terrifying way seems to be a successful strategy. So to emphasize that your neighbors are wearing masks, won't you? Or most people are, or people are increasingly, those are likely to be successful. There's data suggesting that if people are told that if they wear masks, they are protecting others against illness that they might themselves impose on others, there's an increase in mask wearing, so that people don't want to be killers. And to have some way of saying you're a good citizen protecting others, that's even more effective than saying you're going to protect yourself, though the latter is also effective, preliminary data suggests. So 2 paths, don't get dead, wear a mask. That's probably a little too stark, but something like that. Path 2, don't kill anybody. That's also a little too stark. I'll say that New Zealand has been phenomenal at the use of behavioral strategies and nudging to attack the pandemic. And they have more serendipitous circumstances than some other countries because they're smaller and they're sparser, but they have the word unite and the word kind are defining for them. And that's behaviorally really smart.
All right, I'm gonna have Eric Elbot talk now. So Eric, you can speak.
Eric.
So you just need to unmute yourself. You have permission to talk.
Okay.
Perfect.
Alki, thank you for hosting this, and what a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. And I much appreciate these 4 elements, but I'd like to ask you to take it to sort of 30,000 feet for a moment. And that is, there are eras where a lot of social change is happening. And I think there are patterns also where less change is happening over a period of time. I think we are in this post-World War II period when much social change has been happening. Where in that cycle do you see us? Are we toward the end of this cycle of social change and we need to prepare ourselves for a Middle Ages or something? Or are we still in a very vibrant aspect of what you've just described?
What a great question. Yogi Berra, the old baseball guy, said predictions are hard, especially about the future.
Right.
And what I love about his remark is there's a lot of social science that supports what he says, meaning that in terms of what's going to happen on macro things, put to one side preference falsification, because of the immense importance of diverse thresholds and social interactions, it's really hard to know. Who would have thought, and you can finish that sentence in multiple ways, would happen in 2020. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is the most obvious example, but there are other things that Vice President Biden would be the Democratic nominee. Recently, that looked completely crazy. Yes, that Hong Kong would be, I'm not sure what the right verb is, but by China, that was not expected to happen.
No.
So I'd say with respect to humanity's long-term future, I feel very optimistic. I'll tell you the real reason and then the fake reason. The real reason is that I'm a follower in my heart and head of the psychologist Amos Tversky, who said, I'm an optimist, and that's because it's rational to be an optimist, because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice. First, when you think about it, and second, when the bad thing happens. So optimism is a rational way to live. He was making fun of himself, and I'm trying to do the same thing. But if you look at the arc of human history over a very long haul, it's a little like the stock market. Things get better. So there are times when things plummet, but things get better. And there are probably mechanisms we could identify for that, most important of which is there's a stock of understandings, both scientific and cultural, on which people build. So we're in a challenging time when there's social change that's really rapid of multiple kinds, some of it good, not so good. So the valence varies. But in terms of where things will be in 20 or 60 years, probably as much better as they are along important social indicators comparably long ago. The one thing I'm quite concerned about with respect to the prediction I just gave is climate change, where the challenge is very daunting, sometimes described as a wicked problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm gonna go to a question from Ellen Katz, again for COVID. So given the polarization, she's asking, and the other factors you discussed, can you give suggestions of what might work to keep people observing social distancing and other behaviors to limit the spread?
If people think that people like them are engaged in social distancing, the likelihood that they'll social distance too just really increases. So if people think that people like them aren't doing it, think it's stupid, then they're not gonna. But if they see and hear about their friends and neighbors, that's, I think, probably the most important motivator behind social distancing. It's like, well, amazingly, people don't cut in lines. And that's because other people don't cut in lines, and you look like a creeper and oddball if you cut in lines. So there are I think the right word is considerateness. There are norms of considerateness that we obey, without even thinking about them. They're really ingrained. And to get that created as a norm, what are other people doing? Or a second strategy, to get clarity in people that people whom they trust agree that social distancing is a way of reducing the incidence of the disease. So they're protecting others that they care about and themselves. I mean, there's no reason to think that in countries that have had a lot of success on these fronts, that they're fundamentally different from our country. And there are places all over the United States where social distancing is being practiced. And it's a little like, any other form of novel behavior, like not being, let's say, racist, where there are communities where racism was widespread and now it's anathema. Or smoking, when I grew up, smoking a cigarette was completely normal inside. And now it's just not. And that's because other people either are going to disapprove or because people fear they're risking the health of others and they don't want to do that even if they smoke. Ooh, I think there's a muted person.
Hi there, Cass. Thanks very much for your remarks.
Thank you.
My question, in some ways, is a little abstract. I wish I could spice it up with some real-world examples, but it basically is this: the four criteria that you described sort of imply predictability, a sort of cause and effect quality to them, at least after the fact. It can be observed that they are. And yet you seem to admit that the conditions for significant social change are usually invisible. They're invisible until they aren't. And so my question is, can these four criteria be used to anticipate and predict social change? And if so, what is required to use them that way?
Okay, good. I think I'll give two answers, and I'm not sure which one I believe. Maybe I'll figure it out. I'll figure out my own belief. So answer one, it's in the nature of the beast that it's not predictable, in particular cases at least. And that's above all true for two reasons. First, you can't observe what's in people's heads. And second, you can't figure out what people's thresholds are. They themselves often don't know. So the challenge for predictive social science is insuperable by virtue of those two facts. Even if you knew what was in people's heads, and even if you knew what their preferences were, to anticipate social interactions is probably, for all realistic purposes, impossible. And I have data supporting this both pessimistic and, I think, exciting conclusion, which is we can't anticipate it, which is a study of music popularity, where, to make a long story short, you can't predict across a long range of songs which ones are going to tank and which ones are going to do really well, because everything depends on what people see other people as downloading. And you can't predict that because it's serendipitous. So you can create a world in which people will be downloading Kanye West early, and then he will become Kanye West, or a world in which people will be downloading Synergy early, and then Synergy will become a rock group that I was once part of that you've never heard of, Synergy, meaning Synergy will become successful Synergy because people early downloaded. And that's just to say that the social interactions are pivotal to the success or failure of social change. And you can't see what they're going to be. So that pessimistic conclusion about the power of prediction is one story. The other story is it's a little better than that Google and Facebook know something about people's preferences that no institution in the history of the human race has been able to know. And there's a little book out, a terrific book called Everybody Lies, which looks at Google searches to find out what people really like and care about. And it uncovers a lot of surprises. This is a family station, so I won't tell you some of the surprises, but there are a lot of surprises about a wide range of things that are uncovered. So you can know more than ever before about what is in people's heads, and that at least increases the probability that a change is going to happen or not. And you have clues about how to make social change. So the Chinese government is onto some of these points, and it knows how to stabilize things. And some social movements, especially the movement for disability rights, President Trump is actually good at this. He has some intuitions that are evidence-based, even if they don't come from his reading of the evidence. He has some sound intuitions about how to make things happen, which draw on giving people green lights. So with respect to some of his policies, he said, a lot of people think like I do. They're just not willing to say it. That's smart. So you can make it more likely or less likely. And if you can both figure out what's in people's heads a little bit more than you could before, and you can use strategies of green light, red light, then you can do a little better than the first pessimistic account suggests.
Thank you.
Another question from Rolly Cole. that says Jobs is famous for saying consumers do not know what they want until presented with a product. Where do these new or unspoken social wants that you kind of referred to at some point come from?
Okay, that's great. I think what Jobs was saying was something different from my main account. It wasn't about preference falsification. It was closer to the North Korean woman who said it never occurred to me that I would want. But it's more specific than that, that a genius with respect to products, and let's use products really large, in the large sense, can think, people are really going to like this, even though they're not demanding it. And then you have to have some kind of creative imagination. Can I give you some data, policy data, which maps on to Jobs' point? So when I was in the government, we adopted a regulatory mandate, which says every car in the United States has to have a camera so that you can see in back, rear view camera. Every new motor vehicle has to have that. And the Trump administration enthusiastically embraced that idea, so it doesn't divide people along party lines. But here's the funny thing. People weren't demanding the rear view cameras. The markets weren't providing them. Where's the market failure? I have new data suggesting that the rear view camera is, let's say, Steve Jobs' success story. That is, people who have the camera, which now is basically everyone, though my data set had others too. People who have the camera would demand a ton of money to give up the camera, like hundreds of dollars, whereas the cost of the camera is top end $100, more often $50. So it looks like a real bargain from this consumer standpoint, but they weren't demanding it in the first place. It's just they really like it now that they have it.
All right. As more kind of specific question to the theory from Gayatri Sarkar, how preference falsification plays in social and construction of conflict?
Of conflicts. Okay, so there's conflicts among, let's say, employer and employee. It may be that the employer really thinks the employee is bad in some way, but isn't willing to say so until either the anger boils over or until the relationship is ending. And it can happen for employers too, that the employer might think this person is not good, but I won't say so because I don't want them to feel terrible and because they might leave, but too angry to care about their feelings, or it's too doomed. So I'm talking about, job conflicts. But I wonder if the question is about like conflicts between nations, where you can have something really similar, where people in country X could have very negative feelings about people in country Y, but they won't say it because the cost of saying it would be high, and then they'll start to say it. And this can be, a liberation movement, or it can be something awful that leads to completely unnecessary loss of life. So one thing the conflict example suggests is that those norms that suppress preferences sometimes are something to lament. Tocqueville said that slaves had developed something like a preference for the cause of their affliction. And other were critical of Tocqueville has said, yeah, right. Meaning, no, they didn't like what they were suffering, but they shut up about it, Tocqueville, and you didn't see the self-silencing. So to liberate people from the red light can be a good thing, or it can be not so good thing if it liberates, terrible feelings about members of the human species who happen to live in another place.
All right, we have a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to combine two questions from Jim Guska, I'll try my best, and Jim Tal. They're asking clarification questions for the theory. So the one is, can you say a few more words about diverse thresholds? From Jim Guska. Do these relate to abiding personality traits or the situational interdependencies you discussed, or a combination of both? And then the other Jim Tal asks if there's a priority order for this quartet that you mentioned, or is there a dominance in terms of which one can tip social change over the edge, and how might leaders use or misuse this framework?
Okay, great. So I recently read an interview with one of my heroes and co-authors, Daniel Kahneman, who in response to really great questions in a long interview kept saying, "I don't know." And the interviewer kept getting really, disappointed in his answers. And then Kahneman said these words, the following words: "It's an empirical question. I don't have the evidence." So I actually have on my office in Cambridge the words, "It's an empirical question," and I don't have the evidence. That's kind of pathetic, isn't it, to have that up on your office, but I do. Diverse thresholds I can say something about. The priority question, it's an empirical question, which is diverse thresholds are hard to have understanding of through introspection. And so what they are empirically will depend, I think, on both personality traits and on context. So there are some people who are just, let's say, norm abiders, so that whatever the relevant norm is, they're not going to be zeros or ones or twos, but it probably will be dependent on some situations where a norm abider just has a very clear conviction. So I don't know if my Irish American friend is generally in life a zero, or whether he just doesn't like people beating up kids. And there are probably plenty of people who are, high thresholds for risking death on a foreign street, but they're going to do it if someone's beating up a kid. So the both answer is probably the right one. On the priority question, I'm going to say something reckless, which is the group polarization has the priority. That if like-minded people are together, then that's the most reliable source of social change. That's if there are Olympic medals being given, group polarization wins gold, preference falsification gets silver, and social interactions, which are closely related to group polarization, they come in with a bronze.
Right. Cass, thank you so much. I think that's time for us to wrap up. People are asking for the economy and for global warming. I don't know if you want to just say one word, one sentence for each subject, if people want to read more. Otherwise, that's a wrap up for today.
I'd say on climate change, whatever your views on the merits are, the phenomenon of group polarization helps explain the activity of young people, which has had real effects, especially in Europe, where I'm told Germany is pretty aggressive, not as aggressive as some want, but pretty aggressive recent response to climate change is fueled by young people who are moving as a result of their intensification because they're talking to each other. But otherwise, I'm group polarization. I have an internal group polarization mind, which is converging on one word, which is thank you. 2 words, thank you.
All right. So that was on behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association in New England and the Harvard Decision Science Lab. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Cass and Sunstein, thank you. Appreciate it. Always very, very insightful to hear your talks. So thank you, everyone, and take care.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Be safe. Wear a mask.